If you're watching this right now, you're lucky. Not just in the ordinary, I found a cool video kind of way. You're lucky because our planet, this fragile blue sphere we call home, has come terrifyingly close to vanishing in a nuclear firestorm. Not once, not twice, but multiple times, and most people don't even know. On the night of January 23, 1961, a B-52 Stratofortress bomber took off from Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in Goldsboro, North Carolina. Its mission was part of a routine airborne alert program, where nuclear-armed bombers constantly patrolled the skies, ready to strike back if the United States came under attack. It was standard Cold War doctrine, always be ready. But that night, routine turned into horror. The B-52 was carrying 2 Mark 39 hydrogen bombs. Each bomb was more than 250 times more powerful than the one dropped on Hiroshima. Together, they had the potential to obliterate everything within a radius of several miles and leave radioactive fallout drifting across the eastern seaboard. The trouble started when the bomber developed a fuel leak. A wing tank had failed, and the crew was ordered to return to base. But as the aircraft descended, the leak became catastrophic. The plane began to break apart mid-air. At 2 a.m., it entered a flat spin. The order to abandon ship was given. 5 of the 8 crew members ejected and survived. The others died in the crash. But the story doesn't end with the crash. In fact, it only begins. As the aircraft disintegrated, its cargo, 2 fully armed hydrogen bombs, was violently ejected into the night sky and plummeted toward the farmland below. One of the bombs deployed its parachute as designed and settled relatively gently into a field. The other slammed into a muddy patch near Nahunta Swamp and buried itself deep underground. But what's truly terrifying is what happened during that fall. The parachute-deployed bomb underwent a nearly complete arming sequence. Out of the 4 safety switches designed to prevent an accidental detonation, 3 had failed. 3. The only thing that stopped the bomb from exploding was a single, low-voltage switch that remained intact. A $1 safety mechanism, later referred to by a government official as the only thing between the United States and a disaster of unimaginable scale. Had the bomb detonated, it would have instantly incinerated the small town of Faro, North Carolina. But the destruction wouldn't have ended there. Depending on the wind and fallout, radioactive contamination could have spread across Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, New York City, even Boston. The detonation would have killed tens of thousands immediately and left millions exposed to deadly radiation. In 2013, a formerly classified document from the Sandia National Laboratories confirmed just how close this incident came to triggering a nuclear catastrophe. The author of that report, Parker F. Jones, wrote chillingly, "The MK-39 Mod 2 bomb did not possess adequate safety for the airborne alert role in the B-2 in blunt terms. It was a miracle the bomb didn't explode." The second bomb, buried deep in the swamp, was never fully recovered. Most of its components were extracted in the weeks following the crash, but the core of the weapon remains underground to this day. The Air Force purchased a permanent easement on the land to prevent excavation, and warning signs dot the area. For decades, locals were told not to worry. But how can you not worry, knowing that a nuclear bomb lies dormant just beneath your feet? The Goldsboro incident was kept quiet for years. It wasn't until investigative journalist Eric Schlosser uncovered details for his book, Command and Control, that the public began to grasp the full scale of the near disaster. What he found, through Freedom of Information Act requests and deep archival digging, was a story not just about an accident, but about systemic failure. This wasn't a rogue incident. In fact, it was just one of dozens of known accidents involving U.S. nuclear weapons, collectively referred to by the military as broken arrows. Bombs dropped, bombs lost, bombs armed accidentally. From Georgia to Greenland, the Cold War was filled with moments when the most dangerous weapons ever created slipped out of control. The Air Force later redesigned many of its safety systems in response to the Goldsboro crash. But by that point, hundreds of similar flights had already taken place. Each one a roll of the dice, each one flying over American soil with the power to erase cities. What makes Goldsboro especially terrifying isn't just the physics, it's the silence. The crash happened in 1961, but the full story didn't reach the public until more than 50 years later. Had the bomb exploded, there would have been no accident report. There would have been no time for analysis or reform. Just fire, death, and panic. and quite possibly war. Because imagine the headlines. The next morning, nuclear bomb explodes over North Carolina. In the height of Cold War paranoia, how would the Soviet Union have responded? Would they believe it was an accident? Or would they see it as a prelude to war? Nuclear deterrence is built on perception, and one mushroom cloud in the wrong place can erase decades of diplomacy. As the wreckage was cleared and the weapons recovered, most people moved on. But history didn't forget. Buried in government archives and beneath the mud of a Carolina swamp lies one of the closest brushes with nuclear catastrophe in human history. And we were saved not by strategy, not by heroism, but by a simple switch. A circuit that didn't complete. A tiny piece of metal that decided not to fail. The Goldsboro bomb reminds us that when it comes to nuclear weapons, there's no such thing as safe enough. It wasn't a test. It wasn't a warning. It was real. And it happened here. Oh, the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962. In October 1962, the world held its breath. For 13 days, two nuclear superpowers stood on the brink of total war, their fingers hovering over the button, their warheads armed, their bombers circling. It was the most dangerous standoff in human history. The Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't just a diplomatic showdown. It was a moment when miscalculation, pride, and fear could have ended everything. It began with photographs. On October 14th, a U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba captured images of Soviet missile installations under construction. The CIA quickly confirmed the worst. The USSR was placing medium-range ballistic missiles on the island, just 90 miles from the U.S. mainland. These weren't ordinary weapons. They were capable of carrying nuclear warheads that could reach Washington, D.C., New York, and almost every major U.S. city in under 5 minutes. President John F. Kennedy was briefed the next day. His response had to be fast, forceful, and carefully calculated. A full-scale invasion of Cuba was one option. Another was an immediate airstrike on the missile sites, but both carried the risk of Soviet retaliation, possibly in Berlin, or even with nuclear weapons. Instead, Kennedy chose a third path, a naval quarantine of Cuba. Not quite a blockade, which would be an act of war, but a hard line. No Soviet ships would be allowed to bring weapons into Cuba. Behind the scenes, chaos reigned. The U.S. military went to DEFCON 3, then DEFCON 2, the highest alert level ever reached in U.S. history, just one step away from nuclear war. Strategic Air Command bombers were put on 24-hour airborne alert. Missiles were readied. Submarines were deployed. For days, the fate of the world balanced on razor-thin diplomacy and the hope that no one would flinch. But the real danger wasn't always at the negotiating table. It was in the field. On October 27th, known to historians as Black Saturday, a series of horrifying near misses that morning. An American U-2 was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missile. The pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson Jr., was killed instantly. His death could have easily prompted a U.S. military strike on the missile sites, potentially triggering a Soviet counterattack. In fact, U.S. generals urged Kennedy to retaliate. He refused, understanding that one act of vengeance could escalate into full-blown nuclear exchange. But something even more dangerous was unfolding beneath the ocean's surface. Unknown to American forces, a Soviet submarine B-59 was lurking in the waters near the quarantine line. It was armed with a T-5 nuclear torpedo, a weapon designed to destroy entire fleets, U.S. Navy. Destroyers had located the sub and began dropping practice depth charges to force it to surface. To the Americans, it was routine procedure. But to the crew of B-59, cut off from radio contact and surrounded by what they believed were enemy warships, it seemed like war had already begun. The captain of B-59, Valentin Savitsky, ordered the torpedo to be armed. He believed a nuclear strike was justified. Protocol required the agreement of 3 senior officers aboard. The captain, the political officer, and the flotilla commander. 2 gave the order. The third man refused. His name was Vasily Arkhipov. As flotilla commander, he had authority equal to the captain's. He argued passionately that launching a nuclear weapon without clear confirmation of war would be madness. After a heated debate in the cramped, sweltering depths of the submarine, Arkhipov prevailed. They surfaced. No torpedo was fired. No carrier group destroyed. No war unleashed. But it was close. Very close. The incident remained classified for decades. Most Americans never knew how narrowly they had escaped annihilation, not from a missile in a silo, but from a torpedo launched from the dark, pressurized hull of a submarine by men who thought their homeland was already under attack. Back in Washington and Moscow, diplomacy was fraying. Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev exchanged letters, each trying to find a way out without appearing weak. Then a strange twist. 2 messages arrived from Khrushchev. The first was conciliatory, offering to remove missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade. The second, more aggressive, demanded the U.S. also remove its missiles from Turkey. Kennedy's advisors debated for hours. Finally, they chose to respond only to the first, more peaceful message. Secretly, they agreed to the second condition, but insisted it not be made public. On October 28th, Khrushchev agreed. The missiles in Cuba would be dismantled and returned to the Soviet Union. In return, the U.S. publicly pledged not to invade Cuba and privately agreed to remove Jupiter missiles from Turkey within 6 months. The world exhaled, but the damage had been done. Trust between the superpowers had nearly evaporated. Military commanders on both sides were furious. Hawks viewed the agreement as weakness. Doves were simply grateful to be alive. In the aftermath, several key changes were made. A direct hotline was established between Washington and Moscow to allow for instant communication during future crises. Nuclear testing treaties were negotiated, and for the first time, world leaders truly confronted the abyss they had stared into. But none of that would have mattered if Vasily Arkhipov had made a different choice, if Kennedy had listened to his generals, if a single radar system had misread a flock of birds as incoming missiles. The Cuban Missile Crisis is remembered as a triumph of diplomacy, but that victory was balanced precariously on misunderstandings, accidents, and the willpower of individuals under unthinkable pressure. It was a glimpse of how fragile peace can be when armed with weapons of absolute destruction. And it was just the beginning. 3. The NORAD false alarm, 1979. It was the early hours of the morning. On November 9, 1979, when computers at the North American Aerospace Defense Command, better known as NORAD, suddenly lit up with terrifying data. According to their systems, hundreds of Soviet nuclear missiles had just been launched toward the United States. A full-scale attack. The unthinkable had begun. Within seconds, military protocols kicked in. Phones rang in the Pentagon. Officers at Strategic Air Command scrambled into alert positions. Nuclear-capable bombers were prepared for immediate takeoff. The president's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, was woken up with a chilling message. We believe the United States is under attack. Brzezinski didn't wake his wife. He assumed they would both be dead within 30 minutes. This wasn't a drill, or at least it didn't seem like one. The data on NORAD's radar screens showed a massive launch of intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, from Soviet territory, with more following in waves. In Washington, officials scrambled to decide whether to advise the president to authorize a counterstrike. The United States operated under a doctrine known as MAD, mutually assured destruction, which meant that any enemy nuclear attack would be met with a swift and total retaliatory strike. And this wasn't just policy, it was reality. The U.S. maintained a launch-on-warning posture, meaning that if Soviet missiles were detected in flight, the president could launch a response before those missiles even hit. The system was built to function in minutes, with hair-trigger alerts and rehearsed war plans. But that morning something didn't add up. High-ranking officers began to question the data. No satellite had picked up the heat signatures of actual missile launches. No seismic activity. No communication intercepts. Nothing else supported what the computer screens were saying. And the screens, it turned out, were wrong. Dead wrong. In one of the most stunning revelations of Cold War-era defense history, the attack turned out to be a simulation. A training tape had been loaded into a computer system at NORAD's Cheyenne Mountain Complex. The tape mimicked the precise scenario of a Soviet first strike. But due to a serious error, it was fed into the live early warning system, making it appear, as far as the automated systems were concerned, that a real attack was in progress. The people monitoring the system had no immediate way to tell the difference. For 6 agonizing minutes, the world teetered on the edge of annihilation. What's particularly disturbing is how far up the chain the alert climbed before it was stopped. Brzezinski was preparing to call President Jimmy Carter and advise a retaliatory strike. U.S. nuclear bombers were placed on full alert and prepared to take off. Missile crews were ready to open their sealed orders. Only when cross-checks from independent systems began returning no launch detected, did officials realize the entire alarm was based on a false input. 6 minutes may not sound like a long time, but in nuclear command and control systems, it's an eternity, and it's also frighteningly short. Had things gone slightly differently, if, say, weather patterns had caused radar echoes, or if another minor glitch had backed up the false reading, those 6 minutes might have led to 6,000 years of consequences. The aftermath was quietly managed. The public didn't learn about the incident until much later. Internally, the government launched a review of the software and procedures used in its early warning systems. New safeguards were put in place to prevent training tapes from ever being confused with real-world data again. But the problem wasn't just a computer. It was the system. A system so fragile that one misplaced file could launch World War III. A system designed to respond faster than humans can reason. A system built on the assumption that mistakes would never happen, because if they did, there might not be anyone left to correct them. This event was one of several false alarms during the Cold War. Others followed in the 1980s, some even more alarming. But the NORAD incident was the first to expose the terrifying brittleness of our nuclear infrastructure. It wasn't a case of malicious intent or even miscalculation. It was a software error, a misplaced tape, and it nearly ended the world. Even decades later, cybersecurity experts and military analysts cite this incident as a prime example of how nuclear command systems remain vulnerable, not just to enemy action, but to simple human error and technical failure. Imagine a scenario like this today, in an age where AI systems monitor global threats, where cyber attacks can spoof radar, and where geopolitical tensions are once again escalating. How confident are we that such a glitch couldn't happen again? How sure are we that the people in charge will question the data before it's too late? On that November morning in 1979, they did, just in time. But history shows us that we might not always be so lucky. Four, the 1980 computer chip malfunction. Just 7 months after the terrifying false alarm of 1979, another incident unfolded, strikingly similar in tone but rooted in a different technical failure. On June 3, 1980, early in the morning, command centers across the United States once again lit up with alerts a Soviet nuclear strike was underway. First, the computers registered a single missile. Then 2, then 200. This time it wasn't a training tape. The threat indicators came from multiple radar sites and early warning systems. These alerts triggered emergency protocols at the highest levels of U.S. national defense. NORAD raised its alert posture. Strategic Air Command scrambled its nuclear-capable bombers, readying them for potential counterattack. Missile crews were ordered to their launch positions. The National Military Command Center began preparing options for the president. What made this incident so unsettling was that it was not isolated to a single control center or region. The false missile data was appearing across multiple sites on separate systems. Unlike the 1979 simulation tape, where one input corrupted the whole picture, this time, the threat seemed to emerge from multiple, independent sources. And yet, once again, nothing else matched. No infrared satellite picked up any missile launches from Soviet territory. No submarine warnings. No diplomatic or military chatter. No early warning satellites showed even the faintest trace of an actual attack. The data was contradictory. Officials once again found themselves trapped in that same terrible window. Act now and risk initiating Armageddon, or wait and risk being obliterated by a first strike. The 6-minute rule applied again. Military protocol allowed a staggeringly narrow window in which to decide whether to retaliate. Thankfully, again, officials chose to pause to verify. The result of the investigation was almost laughably absurd, if it hadn't been so chilling. A single faulty computer chip costing less than $1 had malfunctioned in a NORAD processor. It was part of the system, responsible for transmitting real-time data to the command centers. The chip intermittently generated false reports of incoming missiles, but because of the way the architecture was set up, the information seemed valid. It had all the signatures of a real launch scenario. The entire alert was the product of a single electronic blip. To be clear, this wasn't a satellite misreading, a radar glitch, or a human misunderstanding. It was a 1-inch piece of silicon failing inside a machine and nearly causing a global catastrophe. Once the root cause was discovered, the chip was replaced, and backup verification systems were updated. But the revelations shook military and government officials. Here was a scenario where a minuscule piece of hardware, a part smaller than a coin, had triggered the same national response as an actual nuclear attack, and no one had been able to detect the fault until after the crisis had passed. Defense Secretary Harold Brown later reported the incident to Congress, admitting that this is a serious matter. He tried to reassure lawmakers that safeguards had worked. But had they really? If a different officer had been on duty, someone more inclined to follow procedure rather than question it, if communications had failed for just a few more seconds, if Soviet radar had picked up a spike in U.S. activity, would the results have been different? What stands out about the 1980 chip malfunction is its sheer banality. It was not a product of Cold War espionage or military brinkmanship. It was an ordinary technical defect, something that happens in consumer electronics all the time. Your calculator freezes, your microwave resets, your car's dashboard blinks. Usually you reboot and move on. But in a nuclear command system, there's no reboot. There's no second chance. This incident forced a re-examination of the idea of reliability in nuclear systems. Throughout the Cold War, both the US and USSR had poured billions into building redundancy, fail-safes, and backup protocols. But what good were all those precautions if a $1 component could still bypass them all? After this event, engineers were ordered to install triple redundancy checks in communication relays and automated sanity checks to evaluate whether incoming missile data made logical sense based on other inputs. But as insiders later admitted, the system still relied heavily on human interpretation and rapid reaction. The tension between automation and judgment had not been solved. Perhaps most hauntingly, the Soviets never knew this happened. Imagine for a moment that they had picked up the elevated U.S. military activity, noticed the scrambling of bombers, and assumed the worst. In that case, they might have responded not out of aggression, but out of fear. The 1980 chip malfunction, paired with the 1979 training tape error, shattered the illusion that the nuclear command systems were ironclad. They revealed a deeper truth. These systems were built by people, managed by people, and vulnerable in all the same ways people are. They could be wrong. They could glitch. They could fail. And we would all pay the price. If the fate of the world could be decided by a chip smaller than your fingernail, what does that say about how close we still are to the edge? The Petrov Incident, 1983. It was the night of September 26, 1983. Quiet, cool, uneventful. At a secret Soviet bunker near Moscow, a man named Stanislav Petrov was settling in for his shift at the Serpukhov 15 Early Warning Center, a place whose very existence was unknown to the outside world. Petrov was a lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Air Defense Forces, tasked with monitoring the Soviet Union's Oko satellite system, which scanned the skies for incoming American missiles. If the system detected a launch, it was Petrov's job to alert the Soviet High Command, who could then authorize a nuclear counterstrike within minutes. What happened next would become one of the most significant, yet least known moments in human history. At 12:15 a.m., sirens began to blare inside the control room. Red lights flashed. The computer screen displayed a chilling message. Missile launch detected. According to the system, a single U.S. intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM, had been launched from a base on the other side of the world. Then a second, then a third. Within minutes, the display showed 5 separate missiles inbound. The protocol was clear. Petrov was to immediately report the launch to his superiors. That report would likely lead the Soviet military to prepare a retaliatory nuclear strike. The logic of the Cold War dictated that there could be no delay, no room for hesitation. In the event of a real attack, every second counted. But Petrov hesitated. Something didn't feel right. He had been trained to believe that a real American first strike would involve hundreds of missiles, not 5. The numbers didn't make sense. The U.S. wouldn't risk Soviet retaliation by only launching a small salvo. It would go all in. Moreover, Ground-based radar installations in the Soviet Union weren't picking up any signs of an actual attack. All the warning was coming from the new and relatively untested satellite detection system. Petrov had to make a decision, and he had to make it alone. If he was wrong, if this really was the beginning of a nuclear war, his inaction could mean the destruction of the Soviet Union. If he was right, and this was a false alarm, reporting the launch would lead to an unprovoked nuclear retaliation against the United States, an apocalypse triggered by a computer glitch. He picked up the phone and told his superiors it was a false alarm. Then he waited. Minutes passed. No missiles arrived. No explosions. The world stayed intact. He was right. Later investigations revealed that the system had misinterpreted sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds as the infrared signature of missile launches. A perfect storm of atmospheric interference had fooled the satellite's sensors and nearly triggered a global war. Petrov's decision not to report the attack broke military protocol. Had his superiors known in the moment that he had refused to escalate the alert, he might have been punished or removed. Instead, his quiet judgment, his willingness to question a machine, saved millions of lives. For years, his actions were buried in Soviet secrecy. Petrov received no public recognition, no medals, no honors. He was quietly reassigned and eventually retired from the military. It wasn't until the late 1990s that Western researchers uncovered his story. And only in the 2000s did the world begin to understand the full magnitude of what he had done. When asked years later why he made the decision he did, Petrov replied, "I had a funny feeling in my gut. I didn't want to be the cause of World War III. That funny feeling may have been the most important gut instinct in human history. The Petrov incident wasn't just a glitch, it was a test of human judgment in a world increasingly ruled by machines. And it revealed a terrifying truth, that the systems designed to save us could just as easily destroy us if we blindly obey them. It also underscored the problem of automation in nuclear warfare, the very idea of having minutes, or even seconds to verify a possible attack, and then decide whether to respond with mass destruction, is inherently flawed. There is no time for context, diplomacy, or nuance. There is only faith in technology and training and protocol. Petrov's choice was an act of quiet rebellion. He chose reason over reaction, doubt over obedience, and in doing so he reminded us that the human element, the ability to question, to feel, to think outside the algorithm, can still be our last line of defense. But what if he hadn't been there? What if another officer, less skeptical, had followed the playbook? What if that next time the system is automated, and there's no Petrov to make the call? The lesson of 1983 is clear. Trust, but verify, and always leave room for human judgment. Stanislav Petrov didn't fire a shot. He didn't lead troops or win a battle. But by sitting still, by refusing to press a button, he may have done more for world peace than any general or diplomat ever could. And once again, the world survived not by design, but by the narrowest margin of chance. 6. Able Archer 83. In November 1983, the Cold War reached a level of tension so intense that it nearly broke. It didn't happen because of a missile launch, or a system glitch, or a rogue commander. It happened because of a military exercise, a simulation, a war game. It was called Able Archer 83. Every year, NATO ran a command post, exercise to simulate the escalation of a conflict between the Western Alliance and the Soviet bloc. These exercises were complex, detailed, and, by the early 1980s, increasingly realistic. In the autumn of 1983, the Able Archer drill was set to test nuclear command procedures, essentially. The steps NATO would take in the event of a full-scale war leading to nuclear release. But this year's simulation looked different. Able Archer 83 introduced new elements: real-time communications, encrypted channels, realistic military movements, and the participation of actual heads of state, including British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and West, German Chancellor Helmut Kohl. From the outside, it looked alarmingly real, and the Soviets were watching. What the West didn't fully realize was that the USSR was already on edge. Earlier that year, US President Ronald Reagan had dubbed the Soviet Union an evil empire and announced plans for the Strategic Defense Initiative, nicknamed Star Wars. a missile defense program the Soviets viewed as a potential first strike enabler. Tensions had escalated further when, in September, Soviet forces shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, which had accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace. All 269 people on board were killed, including a U.S. congressman. The West was outraged. The Kremlin was rattled. Inside the Soviet Union, the leadership, aged paranoid and deeply distrustful of American intentions, was convinced that a nuclear war was not only possible but imminent. Soviet intelligence had launched a massive operation called Ryan, short for Raketno-Ядерное Нападение, or nuclear missile attack, to monitor any signs of a surprise Western attack. They looked at everything: unusual military deployments, movement of diplomats, shifts in communication protocols, even increases in blood donations, which could suggest war preparations. So when Able Archer 83 kicked off, it hit every one of those Soviet warning boxes. NATO command centers went silent, switching to encrypted communications. New codes were used. Military units across Europe began mobilizing, moving planes, testing launch systems, running command protocols for nuclear readiness. To NATO, it was just a drill. To the Soviet Union, it looked like a countdown to war. Behind the scenes, Soviet military forces in Eastern Europe were placed on high alert. Tactical nuclear weapons were prepared for rapid deployment. Intercepts later revealed that Soviet units were instructed to prepare for immediate response. In other words, be ready to fire back. The West had no idea. The US and NATO commanders running Able Archer were unaware that the simulation was being interpreted as real. Had they known, they might have called it off or at least de-escalated, but they didn't. The simulation continued through 5 days of tension, with NATO escalating through various stages of nuclear readiness, just as a real war might unfold. The worst moment came on November 9th, when NATO simulated the transition from conventional to nuclear warfare. In the scenario, Western leaders requested nuclear weapons release authority, a signal that, in a real war, would mean the final step before launch. Soviet forces reportedly responded by bringing actual nuclear armed units to a higher readiness level. One misstep, one real-world action misread as part of the simulation, could have triggered the deadliest war in human history. Then it ended. Able Archer concluded on November 11th. NATO commanders stood down. Troops returned to normal postings, and slowly Soviet forces eased their alert levels. The crisis faded, but only barely. Years later, when documents were declassified and former Soviet officers began to speak, the true scale of the danger became clear. In 1990, Oleg Gordievsky, a high-ranking KGB defector who had served in London, revealed that Soviet leaders were absolutely convinced that the NATO exercise was a cover for a real attack. They were poised to act. Only their uncertainty and a deep fear that they might be overreacting held them back. Analysis confirmed that Able Archer 83 was the closest the world had come to nuclear war since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And unlike that crisis, which unfolded with full awareness and communication between both sides, Able Archer had been silent. One side playing war, the other preparing for it. What makes Able Archer so terrifying is how realistic. Misunderstanding nearly led to catastrophe. There were no technical failures, no glitches, no accidents, just assumptions, fear, and the absence of trust. After the fact, the U.S. quietly began to reevaluate its military exercises. More back-channel communication lines were reinforced. NATO drills were tweaked to reduce ambiguity. But none of these changes were made public. For years, the world went on, unaware how close it had come. Able Archer remains a haunting lesson in the dangers of ambiguity in nuclear signaling. When enemies assume the worst, even a training exercise can become a trigger for annihilation. The scariest part? The only thing that stopped a nuclear war in 1983 was that the Soviet Union hesitated. Not because of diplomacy, not because of a hotline, but because they weren't quite sure. Next time, they might not be so cautious. 7. The Norwegian rocket incident, 1995. On the morning of January 25, 1995, 4 scientists in Norway launched a research rocket to study the Northern Lights. It was a harmless scientific mission, agreed upon in advance and even notified to dozens of countries, including Russia. The rocket, a black Brant the scene, rose into the sky from the Andøya rocket range off Norway's northwest coast. It carried no explosives, no warheads, no military purpose, just instruments, sensors, and a peaceful intent. But within minutes, that rocket would trigger the most dangerous moment of the post-Cold War era. As the missile soared higher into the atmosphere, radar stations in northern Russia detected it. From a technical standpoint, it looked alarmingly similar to a U.S. Trident missile launched from a submarine. A high arc trajectory, large speed and flight path consistent with a nuclear strike on Moscow. Within seconds, alarms went off inside Russia's early warning system. The warning was escalated all the way to the top, fast. Russia's strategic nuclear forces were placed on high alert. The country's nuclear briefcase, the Cheget, was activated and brought directly to President Boris Yeltsin. It was the first and only time in history that a Russian or Soviet president opened the nuclear suitcase in response to a potential live threat. Military advisors fed Yeltsin information in real time. They explained that a missile had been detected, that it might be a U.S. nuclear first strike, that it could be the beginning of a surprise attack, designed to blind Russia's radar before a full-scale bombardment. Yeltsin stood at the threshold of history. He had minutes to decide. The protocols dictated that if he authorized a counterstrike, Russian missiles would be launched immediately. There would be no turning back. And given the nature of nuclear deterrence, the United States would certainly respond in kind. Cities would burn, tens of millions would die, civilization as we know it would end. But Yeltsin hesitated. He asked questions, waited for additional radar data, satellite confirmation, additional analysis. What he was seeing didn't quite make sense. There was no follow-up launch, no incoming wave of missiles. Just one object, fast-moving, high-flying but singular. And then it disappeared from Russian radar. No detonation, no explosion, no further alerts. The Black Brant rocket, which had traveled high into the atmosphere to study auroras, had completed its arc and fallen harmlessly into the ocean. Yeltsin exhaled. The nuclear briefcase was closed. No missiles launched. Later, the Russian military confirmed that Norway had indeed notified them in advance about the launch. The letter had been sent weeks earlier, but had apparently not made its way through the chain of command. Bureaucratic delays, language barriers, or perhaps apathy had buried the information. As a result, Russia's early warning system was caught completely off guard. This single-point failure, essentially a missed memo, brought the world within minutes of thermonuclear war. What makes the Norwegian rocket incident especially disturbing is that it didn't occur during a crisis. There was no Cold War, no heightened tension between the U.S. and Russia. In fact, relations were relatively stable. Boris Yeltsin was seen as a reformer, open to the West. The Soviet Union had collapsed just a few years earlier. Nuclear doomsday was not on anyone's mind. And yet the system still failed. It failed not because of ideology or hostility, but because of miscommunication and systemic fragility. The early warning system worked exactly as it was designed to. It detected a high-speed object and escalated the alert. The command hierarchy functioned as intended. Information went to the top. The nuclear protocols were followed, all of it flawless, until human judgment stepped in. Yeltsin's restraint was vital. So was his calm. If he had panicked or simply followed protocol to the letter, we might remember January 25, 1995, as the day the world ended, not as a curious footnote in the long, terrifying history of nuclear close calls. In the aftermath, Russia reviewed its early warning systems. International coordination procedures were improved. But the incident revealed just how vulnerable even modern nuclear systems remain to false positives, to misreadings, to single-event panics, to the inevitable failures of bureaucratic communication. It's also worth noting how easy it is to forget this incident. It didn't involve a war. No one died. No one even fired a weapon. And yet, the consequences of a different decision, that morning would have been civilization ending. The Norwegian rocket wasn't a weapon, but it might as well have been. It served as a final harrowing reminder that as long as nuclear weapons exist, and as long as they are kept on alert, ready to launch within minutes, the line between peace and annihilation will always be razor thin. Even in peace, the bomb is never silent. Across decades, continents, and political regimes, we have walked a tightrope suspended above oblivion. The 7 incidents you've just seen are not isolated accidents. They are patterns patterns of human error, technological failure, poor communication, and dangerously inflexible doctrine, and in every one of them we were saved not by strategy or systems, but by luck, doubt, hesitation, or the clear-headedness of individuals, willing to question orders and protocols in the most high-stakes situations imaginable. But here's the problem: luck is not a policy. Gut instinct is not a reliable defense strategy, and the systems we still rely on today remain deeply vulnerable, not just to human error but to new threats, cyber attacks, artificial intelligence misinterpretations, deepfakes, and the growing instability of geopolitics. There are still thousands of nuclear warheads on hair trigger alert around the globe, some controlled by stable governments, others less so. The world today is arguably more interconnected, and therefore more prone to cascading failure than ever before. We have stood at the edge of nuclear war not once but multiple times, and each time we've stepped back, sometimes by design, sometimes by miracle. But how long can we keep walking this path before one foot slips? We are not guaranteed a Vasily Arkhipov next time, or a Stanislav Petrov, or a Boris Yeltsin who pauses just long enough. The next close call might not be stopped. The next false alarm might not be questioned. The history of these near misses isn't just a warning. It's a plea to rethink how we manage the most dangerous force humanity has ever created, to build systems that assume failure, not perfection, and to remember that the biggest threat to civilization isn't always malice. Sometimes it's a tape, a chip, a cloud, or a missed message. The bomb is still here. The button is still armed. And history has shown again and again that we are just one decision away from the unthinkable. The question isn't whether we'll be lucky next time. It's whether we'll still be here to tell the story.